Between 2009 and 2015, more than 700 people who ran post offices, also known as sub-postmasters, were wrongly accused of embezzling money and subsequently prosecuted. The fault was actually that of a dodgy computer accounting system. In addition to having to pay back the money from their own pockets, the strain, stress and stigma of this wrongful conviction destroyed the livelihoods of many of the sub-postmasters who were subject to criminal convictions, imprisonment and bankruptcy. In some cases, this also led to illness, divorce and suicide. In 2019, the High Court ruled that the Horizon system was faulty, and in 2020, the government set up a public inquiry. But this has had renewed national interest thanks to the ITV drama Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, which aired in the New Year week, and has resulted in a major intervention by the government this week, which will introduce a blanket law to exonerate all those who were convicted. Freddie, take us through the latest political fallout on this.
Yeah, so Rishi Sunak stood up in front of a crowd on Monday and he said that he had sympathy for the victims, he expressed horror at what happened, but that was sort of it.
People were treated absolutely appallingly. That's wrong, and we should do everything we can to make it right.
There wasn't a big announcement about how the government's going to correct what's happened in the past. There wasn't a huge amount on compensation, and that's changed. So yesterday, before PMQs, Rishi Sunak announced that he's going to introduce some legislation in the next few weeks that will, in effect, have a mass exoneration of those who have been accused under this scandal.
I can announce that we will introduce new primary legislation to make sure that those convicted as a result of the Horizon scandal are swiftly exonerated.
So that's where they are. I think the government have seen that they need to take the initiative on it. They've recognised that the public outcry has been so great that the response so far has been insufficient. And this has placated some people in his party. There's still some calls about whether there's sufficient compensation for those who weren't convicted but were still implicated in the scandal. In some sense, there's also concerns from many lawyers that this is an overreach from Parliament because they're essentially interfering with the independence of the judiciary. The response to that is, of course, that Parliament's the highest court in the land and it's up to Parliament to essentially do whatever they like. But there are some problems with it. But essentially, the key point is that the government has taken the initiative and they have said they're going to try and exonerate all of those involved.
And even if they've introduced this measure, there's further risks, aren't there, particularly to political reputations. So Ed Davey, who was a relevant minister at the time, has been under fire. I think he's been accused of fobbing off victims during the time that he was the minister in charge. Even Keir Starmer, so as head of the Crown Prosecution Service, some of these prosecutions were brought by the Crown Prosecution Service. Was he in charge at the time? What questions does he have to answer? And even Rishi Sunak himself, because I think something like £3.6 billion worth of contracts have been given to Fujitsu, which was the firm running this Horizon IT system that went wrong, while Sunak has been Chancellor and Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And of course, there's all sorts of other characters who will be drawn into this as well.
Yeah, it's worth saying there have been 17 ministers who have been responsible for postal affairs since Horizon was introduced. So I think it's fair to say that all parties are implicated in it.
Yeah.
You're right. At the start of the week, we had the Conservatives essentially briefing a lot that Ed Davey had to resign over this because he was Postal Affairs Minister under the Coalition. I mean, the Coalition forever haunting the Lib Dems. But I think the Lib Dems' response to that was essentially, okay, well, yes, Ed Davey regrets that he didn't know, as he said, he doesn't know that the Post Office was misleading him. However, I think the broader picture, as you say, Anoush, is that so many parties have been in government when this scandal has been going on.
Yeah, and it was actually under John Major's government, wasn't it, when they first decided to try and introduce a computer system
to try and crack down on benefit fraud.
Yeah. And Will, I mean, how does the government decide how to award contracts like this? Like, why is Fujitsu, a Japanese firm, running computer systems in post offices in rural Wales?
Well, I suppose the most fundamental answer is that we have gone through a process in the last sort of 15, 20 years of outsourcing more and more and more of the work of the state to private companies. So when the Tories came in 2010, I think in 2009 to 10 financial year, the government spent about £64 billion on outsourcing. And in the last financial year, that had gone up to 222 billion. So there's been a massive expansion of, the narrative of smaller government under Conservative rule is accompanied by a huge expansion on what we spend on private companies. And Fujitsu is one of a number of what are called strategic suppliers. So these are companies that are essential basically to the running of the state, really. And since 2012, they've had 197 contracts from the government, adding up to, I think it's about 6.8 billion pounds worth of work. And when you look at those contracts, most of them, we don't know how they were awarded, because the people who awarded those contracts haven't recorded the exact process, which is the first sort of red flag in the narrative that outsourcing to private businesses gives you, you get a more efficient state because you have private businesses bidding and it's competitive. In fact, only a very small minority of those contracts were awarded through a competitive tender process. Many more of them were awarded through what's called a call-off agreement from a framework. So a framework is a bit like a kind of VIP lane where the government will decide that a bunch of companies are the most likely people who will do this work. And then they get contracts from that framework. And then in a lot of cases, when you read through these contracts, I was reading through one earlier with HMRC from last year, between Fujitsu and HMRC, and it explicitly says that Fujitsu is the only company that can do this work for them because it's already provided a bunch of IT staff, especially in the case of technology companies. It's really complicated to do. They're probably using a load of proprietary hardware and software, and to take it all out again would be enormously expensive and difficult, and you would end up spending loads more. And so they just kind of have to give it to the same supplier that they gave a previous part of a contract to. And in many cases, companies know that, so they can do things like going in with a very optimistic early sort of contract agreement. Some cases, like the US company Palantir, when they started doing the NHS data store during the pandemic, they did it for £1. And that wasn't because they were just, really generous. It's because they knew that in a year or so's time, in fact, towards the end of that year, they would then get a contract worth hundreds of millions because that service would have become essential and it would have become necessary for the government to issue them with a contract. Obviously, civil servants aren't that easily fooled, but they're also optimistic when it comes to spending public money, and in some cases might well agree to what looks like a nice cheap contract that will have some further cost implications down the line, but they might not be there to take the flak for that.
Yeah, and it makes a bit of a mockery of the whole idea of outsourcing government services, doesn't it? Because the idea is to get the best price, value for money for the taxpayer. But if you're not putting it out to a proper tender process and you're just assuming the same company has to do it each time, then that competition element isn't there. I remember speaking to a Serco insider during the pandemic. I think they'd been sort of outsourced by the DWP to pick up some of the extra universal credit processing, and they were saying exactly this, that the contract had been cheap, knowing that then it's more likely that rather than go through the whole process of tender and trying to find other contractors, then they would just get the same contract for a lot more money in the future. But you've argued in a piece this week, a very good piece, which all our listeners should go and have a look at, that actually Fujitsu shouldn't be necessarily be the only villain of this story. Yeah.
I mean, the piece is called "Don't Blame Fujitsu," which isn't, obviously I love Fujitsu.
Will was not paid for this piece.
This podcast brought to you by Fujitsu. It's not.
Don't joke.
I do say in the piece that Fujitsu is clearly to blame for the failings of the Horizon system. And what is clear is that this is a much wider problem in terms of the way the state is run. The big question about whether you can have a quote-unquote small state, especially, with the kind of cost pressures that we see in the economy at the moment with, things like an aging society. And the people who are perhaps more to blame are the officials, ministers, not just Ed Davey, lots and lots of people. A pattern that we see repeated in scandals like this is officials not being straight with ministers about things. So I've done some reporting on HMRC and the failure to close a tax loophole. And Stephen Timms, who was the minister at the time, said, he just wasn't told about this. On Andrew Marr's other show, which we won't be linking to, but not as good. But Andrew was speaking to Andy Burnham, who said, with regard to the infected blood inquiry,
yes,
he was not given the full information. He was, and that, there is, these processes create this kind of institutional defensiveness.
Yeah.
When the money's not been spent properly, or promises have been made, and then they're kind of, people realise that actually things are going to start to get expensive, and the institution, circles the wagons.
Well, yeah, I was just speaking actually this week to the son of a victim of the infected blood scandal who was making this exact point. He was saying it's almost irrelevant which ministers sort of get put up for blame, because it's the officials, often the same officials, who are giving them the same bad advice or the same bad set of options each time. And so he'd become very disillusioned, having fought for decades for compensation, which he still hasn't received for his family. He'd become disillusioned with the government machine and sort of the way Whitehall works, rather than sort of seeing it as anything particularly party political or seeing any particular minister as a villain.
Yeah, quite. I was speaking to one minister recently, and they essentially said that they only realised that some of their statistics that were key to their policy at the time weren't what they thought they were, is because they had a meeting with their Labour counterpart, and the Labour counterpart pointed it out, and the official was sat next to them, and they turned to look at them, is that true? And the official said, well, yes, I guess it is, but they didn't know themselves. So I think that's right. I mean, Ed Davey, in his defence, is very much tried to blame officials, and also some of the campaigners have as well. Alan Bates, who's the lead campaigner, has been quite clear that it's probably not appropriate to exclusively blame the ministers or Ed Davey, because it is the system at large. I mean, going back to what you were saying, Will, about the sort of chronic dependence that the state has on private sector companies who are either Serco or G4S or whatever it might be. I mean, it does speak to an erosion of state capacity. I mean, you'll have those on the right who will say, well, actually, if you look at state spending as a proportion of GDP, it's extremely high. Well, yes, sure, but we also have to look at the challenges that are facing the state. People are calling for higher defence funding. We've got an ageing population. We've also had such low growth that percentage, obviously, as a percentage goes up in relation to the size of the economy. So there are problems with the capacity of the state, and I think that's part of the problem, because you can go through the list of scandals that we've seen over the years and the failure of the government to grasp them or to mete out justice. And ministers are held to blame, but really we are seeing such an endemic issue and on so many occasions that you have to look at the system itself.
Yeah, and is there soul-searching in Westminster going on about this idea of the outsourced state? So, Fujitsu, for example, you'll surely remember this, they often have this sort of glitzy lounge at Labour and Conservative Party conferences. They're very much, like Will was laying out in terms of the contracts, they're very much sort of embedded in the government machine. There are some who are calling for Fujitsu actually not to be allowed any further contracts before they've sort of come and answered for themselves. I think they've been invited to the Business Select Committee to come and answer questions. But is it a wider issue that some politicians are seeking to address?
I mean, soul searching is probably always too far a term for Westminster, but I think
yeah, they don't have souls. Sorry, I forgot about that.
No, I will also want to go that far, Anoush. But I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? That I do think the tone's probably shifted within the public discourse in the past 20 years. If you go back to the New Labour era, the whole point then was about injecting market principles into how we provide public services. I think that's gone away to some extent. We still got talk about public sector reform under Labour, but they're quite resistant, I think, to say that market principles as such, just on principle, should be injected. I mean, it's interesting as well, if you look back to the privatisation of Royal Mail, obviously separate to the post office, but the privatisation under David Cameron. I mean, in many ways, it's been a failure, because Royal Mail now have got these huge problems with profit. They're struggling to stay afloat. For instance, you've got the unions who are going on strike, and they also have this legal requirement for universal service, which is the post coming 6 days a week, which they say they can't really do as a private profit-seeking company. Well, yeah, because Amazon don't do that, the competitors don't do that, so of course, I mean, they're going to struggle to do that. I mean, I think that speaks to the fact that as soon as you have the government trying to confuse or try and outsource things that only a government or a state can naturally do, then you are going to encounter problems.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not always the way. I think for Labour it should be about what works rather than sort of rejecting the principle of injecting the market into the state or not. Because I remember speaking recently to a former prison governor who'd worked in public prisons, and they were saying, private prisons now are much better run than public prisons because of the state that public prisons are in. They can't, afford to pay their staff or retain their staff properly, and all of the issues that we've spoken about on previous podcasts that I won't go through. Whereas private prisons, are much more, prisoners want to be sent to those. If they're going to be transferred, they want to go to a Serco-run prison or something. So it's not always the case that these big government contractors are necessarily the bogeymen, but it depends on which part of the state you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it also depends on how realistic the accounting is. And I think maybe there is an opportunity now for the accounting principles of government to be assessed. I mean, look at the constantly shifting number of tens of billions that HS2 may or may not cost. The reason those costs vary so much is to do with the initial business case that has to be made, which is to do, which then, becomes very, very optimistic. The returns are overstated and the extent to which the costs will inflate are understated. Because there isn't a single principle of sort of honest accounting within government that everyone is held to, and I think that is a real problem in public procurement.
Yeah, and we shouldn't forget that there are sort of a lot of people at the heart of this story whose lives have been put on hold or destroyed by this scandal, and there's so many other miscarriages of justice where people are still waiting for justice. So, there's still members of the Windrush generation who are waiting for access to that compensation scheme. I think there were, as of last summer, there were still 3 Grenfell families who were stuck in temporary accommodation. So they still hadn't been rehoused properly. You have the infected blood scandal victims, which I mentioned. I've been looking into this for a piece this week about why it just takes so long. And, there's all sorts of different elements to this. The government can worry about the costs of paying out those compensations. That's a big part of it, particularly what you were saying, Will, about sort of Whitehall officials being, thinking about the short term in terms of saving money. But there's also, I think, which I've picked up from people that I've spoken to, perhaps a lack of respect or a lack of recognition that people often who, don't necessarily have a loud political voice are suffering at the hands of this big, bureaucracy, the machine. And it does take something like this to capture the public imagination to make politicians act.
I think in the case of the post office scandal, it's just it seems in retrospect so wild that anyone really believed that hundreds and hundreds of people were all committing exactly the same crime in the same way. That
at the same time.
Yeah, a whole class of employees of one organisation had suddenly decided to commit theft or fraud on quite a large scale. It just seems inherently improbable. But like you say, they just weren't believed. And, that's... There are lots of cases. I think personally the loan charge scandal is another one that's potentially brewing. That's affected as many as 70,000 people. As in the case of the post office scandal, there have been suicides of people who have been affected by it. But a lot of those people they've been telling me they just aren't listened to by government. The institutional reaction to ministers is very clear that these people are wrong. That they were in the wrong, and the institution protects itself, and the victims aren't listened to.
There's also if we look at the political consequences of this as well, it's not surprising that so many people are frustrated, apathetic about politics when all of these scandals go on for so long. Alwyn Turn has got a great book on the noughties where he speaks about the erosion of trust that occurred during that period and how it sort of led to some of the political problems that we saw in the 2010s. If you look at the child sex abuse scandal, it was followed by the expenses scandal. We had the Iraq War. There were so many ways in which public authority was sort of seen to be at odds with the truth. And it can't be good to have all of these things constantly coming up and people just look at it and go, I can't trust the politicians because, either they don't have the proper information because the state itself isn't providing it, or they're trying to cover their back, or justice will take years and years after a public inquiry to come to the fore. And I think that's almost a consequence or something that it feels quite like a modern phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's something that it's sort of defined the past 2 decades as such.
I think it can often be an electoral risk, particularly to the Conservatives. So I've been looking into the cladding and wider building safety crisis for a long time. And often these people are the sort of, dream Tory voters. They're young professional couples who are wanting, on the brink of starting families. They've done everything the Conservative government has told them to do with Help to Buy, saving money to buy a property. And then suddenly they're coming up against this understanding that the government doesn't really care about their situation, and they're being blamed for buying a leasehold that they bought in good faith and in a nice new flat that looked lovely. And suddenly they're realising that actually there's no one on their side. And it really is radicalising. Like, some of the people that I've spoken to have said that they'd never vote again, or that it made them feel very differently about politics to how they felt before. One person who was an entrepreneur, he was starting his own businesses. He worked in America. He was very conservative in his values, said that, he couldn't trust the Conservative government ever again because of the state that he'd been put in. So I do think there are big political consequences to these kind of scandals.
If we look at Keir Starmer's New Year's speech, the whole point of that was about reinvigorating trust in politics. Yeah. He wanted to, as he always says, he wants to shift away from the short-term politics that he sees as defining Westminster and this sticking plaster politics, and he wants to focus on the long term. Well, that's great. I mean, lots of people say that all the time. I do think in many ways he's almost a hostage to fortune, or at least at the very least, the expectations are going to be raised when he comes into office, for him to instill some sense of professionalism, some sense that the state is actually dealing with problems as it should. And if he doesn't do that, I think there will be electoral consequences.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.